It begins with a hinge. Not the grand archway or the carved lintel that tourists photograph, but the hinge, a rusted iron eye protruding from a sandstone jamb, still perfectly aligned with nothing at all. There is no door attached to it. There is not even a doorway, if we are strict with language, just a vertical seam in the masonry, a suggestion of an opening half erased. You have to stand very close to notice that the stones on one side are fractionally thinner, shaved down to accommodate a leaf of wood or bronze long vanished. The wall is blind and continuous, solid under the echo of your knuckles. No cavity behind it, at least not at the shallow depth. Any guard will tolerate you tapping. But the hinge is there. Two of them, in fact. The lower one at ankle height, corroded into an orange bloom. The upper one, sharp-edged, barely pitted, still waiting for a weight that will never return. There is a tiny asymmetry between them. The distance from the floor to the lower hinge is a few millimeters less than the distance from the upper hinge to where the lintel should have been. That kind of misalignment is common in village carpentry, less so in a ceremonial hall calibrated to the rising of a specific star. The guidebook does not mention the hinge. It is catalogued somewhere. A drawing has been made. A person in the past has put a number on it, a small circle on a plan, probably in red pencil. But in the glossy narrative sold in the museum shop, this hinge, this non-door in the northern retaining wall of the inner terrace, is simply omitted. Too minor, perhaps. Too awkward, too difficult to explain in 2 lines beneath a page of full-colour reconstruction. I did not find it the first time. I found it when my shoe squeaked on that particular flagstone, the way rubber sometimes shrieks against an unexpected smoothness. I shifted my weight, annoyed by the sound, and my eyes just happened to be at the height of the iron eye, where it thrust itself into my field of view like a punctuation mark in the wrong sentence. The feeling was not revelation. It was something smaller and more corrosive. The quiet discomfort of a hair out of place in a perfectly combed head, something that shouldn't matter, but somehow does. A hinge without a door is a simple thing. People remove doors all the time. You could say they took it off its frame and walled the gap. Defensive reasons, ritual reasons, practical reasons. The world is full of reasons. Still, the stonework here is of a single campaign. The courses run unbroken. The patina deepens at the same depth on every block. To cut a doorway and then uncut, it would have left a scar, different mortar, different weathering, the unmistakable texture of an afterthought. But this wall does not look like an afterthought. It looks like the first and only thought. The hinge, by contrast, looks like a late arrival to a party that finished centuries ago. If it were only this one, perhaps I would have let it go. A note in a margin, at most. One hinge, one misaligned structural ghost, swallowed inside the immense mass of stone, myth, and tourism that is the site, but the body resists. The eyes begin to search for repetition, like a tongue worrying the edge of a cracked tooth. You start to notice other non-doors. A blind threshold sketched into the south courtyard of a completely different site, its jambs halfway carved and then simply stopping as if some invisible hand froze mid-chisel. A stair that rises in a tight spiral between 2 walls and ends in masonry so thick that even modern sensors can't confirm a hollow on the other side. A balcony facing a cliff, reachable only from a corridor that has no junctions. No entry point, just an origin lost under centuries of rubble. They show up first as anomalies in photographs, then as annotations in excavation reports, then as small irritations in your own field notes. You find yourself drawing doors that lead nowhere on the edges of meeting agendas. You catch the gesture and look around, suddenly aware of your own fingers repeating a pattern they learned somewhere else. One hinge, one uncut doorway, one staircase that dies inside a wall. In isolation, each is a curiosity. Together, they begin to feel like a whisper of a pattern. So you widen the frame. At some point, every discipline builds a story on top of its details. Archaeology is no different. We stitch bricks and bones into a grand narrative of kings and floods, migrations and collapses, calendar reforms and dynastic feuds. The foundations of that story are practical things: quarry sources, transportation routes, labor estimates, how many oxen, how many days, how many hands per cubic meter of stone raised against gravity. Those details are supposed to close the system, to make the past self-consistent. It is when the hinge creeps into the technical drawings that the discomfort sharpens. On one plan of a mountain citadel dated to the late 1970s, a door symbol is inked into a wall that no longer exists. The legend notes, "Blocked in antiquity, function unknown." In later editions of the same plan, the symbol is gone. The wall is drawn thicker. The note disappears. Somewhere between drafts, the door that led nowhere has been edited out, as if the site too were embarrassed by its own dead ends. In a logistic reconstruction of an ancient fortress city, 27 gates and postern doors are carefully mapped to match the known movement of goods and troops from the surrounding plains. Supply flows are balanced: grain in, weapons in, taxes out. The spreadsheet is elegant. It closes neatly. There are no surplus oxen, no unexplained carts. But when you overlay the plan of the blind staircases, the sealed balconies, the non-doors, some of them intersect with the most intensely trafficked arteries. Solid masonry where the model insists there should be paths. Paths where the stone insists there is only wall. If this small thing is wrong, a tired part of you murmurs, what else is misplaced in the big story built on top of it? You check the measurements. You realign the coordinate systems. Perhaps the modern survey is slightly off. Perhaps the older drawing used a different datum. Excuses like sand pour easily into cracks. Yet the misfit remains. The hinge stays where it is. The blind stair still stops one step short of making sense. In the technical literature, these anomalies are often assigned to what might be called the miscellaneous basket. Ritual feature, structural redundancy, later modification. The language is careful, neutral, and slightly evasive. It recognizes that there is something there without committing to the discomfort of saying, "We do not know why." The more plans you lay over one another, the more that basket fills. Small symbols accumulate, half erased, marginal, tacked on. A door suggested, then crossed out. A corridor whose dashed line fades at the very place where continuity would be most useful. You begin to see the difference between the built environment and the drawn one. On paper, the ancient city is rational. Its spaces flow like diagrams. People and goods move through routes optimized for whatever narrative the scholar favors. Defense, trade, ceremonial procession. On the ground, in the dust and shadow, the stone tells a slightly different story. It is one in which some doors open onto blankness, some corridors are narrow to the point of cruelty, some staircases rise into silence. It feels at times like the builders were answering a question that the plans cannot remember. I am not asserting anything here. I am not claiming cults in the walls or hidden chambers stuffed with forbidden instruments. I'm only following the itch of a detail. A hinge where there should be none. A door symbol that appears on one plan and vanishes on the next. A consistent inconsistency between the logistics we reconstruct and the physical reality that resists our reconstructions. The engineers assure us that nothing essential is at stake. Trade still flowed, armies still marched. The city still lived and died by familiar mechanisms: harvest, tax, war, drought. All true, probably. Civilizations do not depend on a single hinge. And yet the thought persists, low and slow, like a bass note under a melody you can hum but not quite hear. If we misread the small things, how secure can we be about the large ones? If our maps cannot accommodate a door that does not lead anywhere, what else have we quietly rounded off, smoothed over, edited out of the story so that it will fit onto the page? These are minor questions, but minor questions have a way of becoming hairline cracks in very large walls. You find yourself standing again in front of that first hinge, the one in the northern retaining wall on a day when the tourists have retreated to the shade and the guards are busy with their phones. You look at the stone. You look at the metal. You run your fingers along the seam where the imaginary door would have swung, and you feel, under the dust and centuries, the faintest ridge, as if something once moved here with a regular, unhurried rhythm. The air is still. The wall is mute. The site offers no revelation, only a quiet, persistent dissonance, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect chord. I do not know what it means. I do not know if it means anything at all. But once you have seen one door that leads nowhere, you begin to wonder whether the story of ancient structures, as we tell it, is complete, or whether we are walking through a house whose floor plan is missing a few rooms, whose walls remember openings our diagrams have chosen to forget. I should have let it stay as an irritation, the kind a scholar mutters about over coffee and then boxes away with other benign inconsistencies. But anomalies are rarely polite. They do not wait for invitations. They arrive in clusters, the way certain illnesses bloom not in one organ, but all at once across a system that once seemed stable. The first cluster showed itself in the archives, where the air smells faintly of mold and metal drawers. I was looking for something unrelated, a trade tariff tablet from a River Valley polity, and the librarian handed me the wrong folder. A mistake of labels. Inside was a cross-section drawing of a fortified hill shrine surveyed in the mid-20th century. The line work was spare, competent, unquestioning. But there it was again, a doorway sketched in dotted lines fading halfway into a supporting wall that, by any structural logic, should not have accommodated a void. The second cluster emerged weeks later inside a different civilization altogether. I was reviewing 3D scans of a desert necropolis when the rendering glitched, showing a faint recess behind what had been documented as a solid funerary stele. I assumed a scanning error until the technician, embarrassed, told me the glitch appeared only in that sector, regardless of the equipment used. It was as though the stone wanted to suggest a space without confirming it, the way an old photograph sometimes implies a person standing behind someone else, but refuses to resolve their outline. Then came the third, more unsettling than the others. A basalt platform in a coastal ruin where a lintel lay collapsed, revealing its underside. On that hidden plane, never intended to be seen, were carved guide marks for what looked unmistakably like door brackets. Brackets for a door that would have opened downward, into earth, into solid rock. A conceptual absurdity. A door that would have swung into matter, not air. 3 points might still be coincidence, but 2 more soon followed, dropping into my notes like stones into a still pond. A highland citadel, where a narrow corridor ended in a rough wall of rubble, until someone noticed during cleaning that the rubble had been placed with ceremonial precision, each stone polished on only one side, the side facing inward as if a hidden audience were receiving a facade meant solely for them. And deeper still, a temple foundation in a jungle basin, where LiDAR revealed a grid of small rooms beneath the floor. They were perfectly square, perfectly sealed, perfectly inaccessible. They were too uniform to be natural voids, too purposefully arranged to be accidental. Yet no chamber, no shaft, no crawl space connected to them. Rooms meant never to be entered by any living being, ever. 5 anomalies, 5 doors in the broader sense, 5 impossible structures across sites divided by mountains, languages, centuries, 5 signals that did not correlate but nevertheless rhymed with one another in a way I could not ignore. To describe them clinically is easy. To meet them with your own body is something else. My moment of fracture, the personal shock, came in the southern plateau, where a wing-carved escarpment hosts a civic complex older than most records dare to date. I had gone there on an off-season permit, the kind issued reluctantly with numerous restrictions. The sun was low, the air thin, the plateau quiet in that way mountains have of muting even your own heartbeat. I had been instructed to avoid the Western Gallery, unsafe footing, risk of collapse. Yet a dry curiosity tugged me toward it, not out of defiance, but out of the same slow compulsion that draws a finger back to the hinge of an unanswered question. The gallery was narrow, the walls close, the dust long settled. At its far end, the corridor appeared to terminate in a blank slab of stone. Another dead end, I remember thinking, though the alignment felt slightly wrong. The floor dipped half a degree lower than it should have. The air tasted faintly metallic. These things you learn to notice when you have spent enough time with ruins, the way a space carries tension, the way a dead end does not always feel dead. I stepped closer. There, on the left side of the wall, barely visible under the sediment of ages, was a vertical groove. Not natural erosion, not tool marks. A track worn in a semi-arc as though something had swung open hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times, guided by a pivot still buried in the wall. A door had been here, not metaphorically, not in theory. In iron and timber, or bronze and bone, who can say? But the physical signature of motion was unmistakable. The abrasion where weight shifted, the smooth curvature where friction had polished stone. The kind of mark no ceremonial symbol could leave. This was a mechanism, a real one. I knelt, my palm hovering above the groove. The wall radiated cold, a dense ancient cold, the kind you find in glaciers or tombs that have never known sunlight. The corridor behind me seemed to tilt, unmoored from its geometry. The plateau's silence pressed against my ears until I could hear my pulse in my teeth. Something in me recoiled. Something else leaned forward. I pressed lightly, just lightly, against the center of the wall. It did not move, of course. I had not expected it to. But beneath my fingertips, through stone older than empire, I felt the faintest give. Not a shift. Not elasticity. More like the echo of a mechanism long frozen, its memory of movement surviving in some ghost of tension. I remained like that for an indeterminate time, hand on an immovable wall, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of sound. The way an old musician listens for a note that has ceased, yet still vibrates in the bones of the instrument. When I finally withdrew my hand, my palm tingled, numb at the edges, as though it had fallen asleep gripping something heavy. But the corridor felt different, slightly darker, slightly larger, slightly off, as if the proportions of the space had shifted by a fraction too small to measure but too large to ignore. I left the gallery without documenting anything. No photograph, no rubbings, no detailed measurements. I walked back to camp in a state I can only describe as quietly unstitched. Something had crossed a line inside me. A hinge clicked inward or outward, I cannot say. I could no longer accept the miscellaneous basket. I could no longer trust the neat explanations constructed by those who had not knelt where I had knelt, had not felt the breath of cold stone where a door had once moved. It was not belief. It was not theory. It was simply the moment when the rational framework I had held for years felt suddenly, irreversibly inadequate. After that, every dead-end corridor felt suspect. Every sealed threshold felt too deliberate. Every blocked passage felt like a sentence with most of its words erased. I am not making claims. I am not proposing hidden realms or secret societies tucked behind ancient stone. I am only saying that once you have touched the groove of a door that should not exist, you cannot pretend the hinge was ever just an ornament. You begin to feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing not from the outside, but from within the walls themselves, quiet, patient, waiting for someone foolish or persistent enough to listen. And I fear I've been listening ever since. There is a particular discomfort that arises when one must take apart the very narrative that once provided structure. It is like unthreading the stitching of a familiar coat while still wearing it. Each tug exposes a draft of cold air you were not prepared to feel. For years, the official explanations of the ancient structures felt sufficient, tidy, economical, self-contained. But once the anomalies formed a constellation rather than isolated points, the story frayed, it seems showing not under force, but under quiet, persistent observation. The historical consensus, as it is printed in glossaries and recited on tours, insists on functionalism. A blocked corridor is a later addition. A sealed threshold is defensive. A staircase ending in masonry is ceremonial. A hinge without a door is simply a remnant of architectural change, a fragment of some small adjustment lost to time. These claims are confident in tone but hollow in mechanism. They work only if one refuses to examine how ancient builders actually worked, their logistics, their materials, their labor constraints. Consider the simplest point. A doorway is expensive. To cut a frame through load-bearing stone requires manpower, time, and the precise coordination of masons who understood their material far better than we give them credit for. To cut such a doorway and then fill it perfectly, seamlessly, leaving no structural trace of the alteration, this is harder still. More labor, more time, more cost. The idea that ancient engineers casually opened and closed passages like capricious scribes editing their drafts is not only technically implausible, it disrespects the economy of effort that governed all pre-industrial construction. Their cities were built with intention, not whim. Yet the official story leans on whim, because intention leads to an uncomfortable question. Intention toward what? When I revisited the logistic models with this in mind, the gaps widened. No ancient state would waste manpower carving staircases that rise into mute stone. No priesthood would divert resources to construct corridors whose ends they would then bury under rubble arranged with almost obsessive symmetry. Our reconstructions of their supply chains are too tight, too delicately balanced for such extravagance, and yet the extravagance is there, written into the stone that required quarrying, shaping, transporting, aligning. The more I examined, the more the old story collapsed under its own weight. The supposed defensive blockages were often on the wrong sides of walls. The ceremonial closures faced directions that had no cosmological meaning for the cultures in question. The claimed later modifications dated by Toolmark and Patina to the same original construction phase. Each inconsistency was minor, yes, but taken together, they formed a mass too heavy to ignore. And then there is the matter of aesthetics. We like to imagine ancient builders as crude experimenters whose efforts would be refined only across centuries, but this notion evaporates the moment one stands before their work. Their carvings show a precision we struggle to replicate even with laser-assisted equipment. Their masonry joints are so fine a knife blade cannot slip between them. Their proportional systems reveal a mathematical subtlety that feels, frankly, excessive for cultures we often caricature as early. Yet alongside this mastery lie the dead-end doors. The sealed rooms, the invisible chambers no ceremonial procession would ever witness. These are not crude. They are executed with the same meticulous hand, the same symmetry, same geometry, same aesthetic nerve. Whatever these non-doors were, they mattered enough to be crafted beautifully, invisibly, permanently. Our own era rarely hides its finest work. We decorate what we display. We leave the unseen cheap, unfinished. But these builders did the opposite. Their secret spaces are as polished as their temples. Their blind thresholds are carved with as much care as their altars. Their dead corridors are as carefully proportioned as audience halls. This inversion of aesthetic purpose is, perhaps, the most disturbing inconsistency of all. Beauty in any culture reveals priority, and here, beauty is lavished on places where no audience was meant to stand. Unless the audience was not human. I do not say this literally. I'm not speaking of gods walking in hidden halls or cults building sanctums no mortal could reach. I only observe that the aesthetic logic is misplaced if we assume the structures were built solely for the people we know about. This is where the old narrative disintegrates. Not dramatically, not with the noise of conspiracy, but quietly, as a rope phrase, strand by strand. We assumed the cities were built for the inhabitants whose bones we found. We assumed the corridors were cut for feet shaped like ours. We assumed the doors were meant for the rituals we reconstructed. But what if those assumptions are the very things that blind us? This is where I find myself drifting into what some colleagues would call speculation. I prefer to call it a thought experiment, an intellectual exercise, nothing more binding than a shadow passing over a floor. Imagine for a moment that the structures we excavate are not the first layer of civilization, but the second or the third, that they are inheritances, not inventions, that the builders we credit with their creation were not architects but restorers, repairing, repurposing, misunderstanding. Imagine a world where collapse is not a singular apocalypse, but a cycle, where societies rise, fall, and rebuild atop the bones of those who came before. Imagine that the doors that lead nowhere once led somewhere, in an epoch whose memory dissolved like pigment in rain. If that were true, then the dead ends are not absurdities. They are remnants, architectural fossils, artifacts of a floor plan we no longer possess. Or consider another frame, that the world resets, not through mythic flood or divine wrath, but through internal failure, ecological, technological, existential. Each cycle wipes away knowledge, but leaves stone. Knowledge is fragile. Stone is stubborn. A hinge can outlive an empire. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest possibility I allow myself to articulate, the builders were responding to constraints or forces we do not know, cannot imagine, and may not want to meet. Constraints that demanded doors to nowhere, chambers without entry, corridors meant to terminate, a design language we inherited without translation. I am not asking anyone to accept these possibilities. I do not accept them myself, not fully. They simply hover at the periphery of the anomalies, like silhouettes glimpsed through fog. When a narrative collapses, one is allowed, briefly, to let the imagination roam the ruins before constructing a new scaffolding. I am left at this stage not with an alternative history, but with a question suspended above all others. What if the ancient structures we study were never meant to make sense within the logic of the present cycle? What if sense itself is cyclical? This is not a conclusion. It is only the faint outline of a different way of looking, one that holds the anomalies not as mistakes in the archaeological record, but as hints of a framework we were never taught to see. A framework in which doors that lead nowhere are not errors, but memories. Quiet and immovable, waiting in stone for someone willing to follow a path that ends abruptly and ask, what stood here before the world forgot? I am still asking. There is a moment, usually late in the journey, when the anomalies stop being architectural questions and begin to press against something more central, something that has nothing to do with stone or hinges or the precision of vanished hands. It is the moment when the world itself feels slightly misaligned, as though reality bears the same subtle discontinuities as the ancient structures, seams that do not match, pathways that end where they should continue, echoes with no clear point of origin. I do not know if everyone reaches such a moment, perhaps only those who have stared too long at doors that do not open, perhaps only those who have learned to listen to silence until it rings. I found myself returning involuntarily to a strange metaphor, one I had once dismissed in a conversation overheard between two students. They had compared the world to a polygon in a half-rendered game, a shape whose edges form a convincing surface only until you look too closely at its vertices. At the time, I laughed inwardly. But now, after months of tracing impossible corridors and sealed chambers with no logistics to justify them, the metaphor returned with uncomfortable persistence. What if the world, our world, is not smooth at all? What if it is faceted, angled, built not on continuity but on discrete planes? And what if the ancient structures, in their stubborn refusal to fit our narratives, are pointing toward the edges of that polygon? Not in any mystical sense, but in an existential one, as if they are reminders that the world does not owe us coherence, that the coherence we perceive is simply the resolution available to us at the moment we look. The doors that lead nowhere feel at times like stress points in this polygon, places where the surface buckles slightly, revealing the underlying framework, not of an ancient civilization, but of the experience of being human. The blind corridors, the sealed thresholds, the unreachable chambers, they resonate too cleanly with the ways our own lives accumulate invisible rooms we cannot enter. Choices we almost made, futures that almost happened, versions of ourselves that remain sealed off behind decisions we barely remember making. Sometimes I wonder whether the ancients built these structures to confront themselves with the same truth, that existence is not a straight corridor, but a compound of expendable paths, most of which end abruptly. That meaning is not located at the end of a passage, but in the act of walking it, even if the air grows thinner and the floor dips imperceptibly and the wall refuses to move. Or perhaps it is simpler, more austere. Perhaps the anomalies are not warnings, but reflections, mirrors carved in stone. When we look at the dead-end door, we see the dead end within us. When we find a hinge with no purpose, we recognize the parts of ourselves built for functions we will never understand. When we touch a sealed chamber, we feel the weight of all the sealed chambers in our own memory, rooms locked by time, trauma, or the slow sediment of forgotten years. If the world is a polygon, faceted, rigid, unfinished, then the ancient structures are the places where the edges show through. I do not say this is true. I only say it is a frame that eases a certain tension in the mind. The older I grow, the more I suspect that existence is not designed for comfort, but for pressure. That suffering is not an aberration, but an assignment. That the world functions less like a garden and more like a proving ground. Granular, angular, forcing us to move in uncomfortable directions. A test, not in the moralistic sense, but in the mechanical one, stress applied to material to reveal its properties. And perhaps the ancients understood this in ways we do not. Perhaps their architecture was not merely shelter or ceremonial theatre, but an existential instrument, something that hinted at the structure of existence itself. A way of teaching or reminding or warning, this world has edges, learn their shape. If so, then the doors that lead nowhere were never meant to be opened. They were meant to be seen. They were meant to unsettle, to slow the observer, to invite the kind of attention that shifts from stone to self without announcing the pivot. This may all be speculation. It is speculation. But there is something undeniably present in those doorways that is not reducible to logistics or ritual or erosion. Something that asks, not through words, not through doctrine, but through presence, whether we have looked closely enough at the world we inhabit, and whether the world might be looking back. I do not want to conclude anything. Conclusions pretend to be doors that open, but most of them simply lead into smaller rooms. What I want, quietly, without insistence, is to leave you with the same sensation that has accompanied me since the day I touched the groove in that buried corridor. A sense that reality has more seams than we admit, that those seams are not flaws, but invitations. If you have felt in some distant corner of your life that something does not align, if you have noticed moments that feel like echoes or misprints or hinges with no door, then perhaps you already understand the impulse behind this entire journey. Not to believe, but to observe, not to declare, but to doubt with precision. Not to discover a hidden world, but to notice where the visible one flickers. I do not ask you to follow me. There is nothing to follow, only corridors whose ends we do not yet understand. I offer no doctrine, no revelation, no final room in which truth stands waiting. I offer only the same quiet, steady thing the ancient stones offered me, a question. If you want to continue walking with that question, slowly, deliberately, without fear of the dark corners, then stay close. If you want to keep noticing the hinges no one else sees, the doors that should not be, the edges where the polygon shows through, then stay. We still have much to observe.